Okay, good evening to you. My name's Tony Binns. I'm based in the School of Geography, and I've been a member of the leadership group of the OGHI ever since it started. I'm sure Philip will remind me how long ago it was. I think it was probably 6 or 7 years ago, but it's been very successful, and every year we have this conference round about this time. And one of the high spots of this conference is the McKinlay Oration. We always have this during the conference. The McKinlay Oration is named after the McKinlay family, who very generously endowed a chair here at the university, a chair in the Center for International Health, which is presently held by Professor John Crump. John is currently on research leave, I believe in the US, coping with whether or not there's been a success in the election and all the rest of it. But we're very grateful, genuinely, we're very grateful to the McKinlay family for endowing this chair in our Center for International Health. Our speaker tonight in the McKinlay Oration is Professor Robert Huish, Bob Huish. He's based at Dalhousie University, which is in the far east of Canada, in Halifax in Nova Scotia. And I actually know Bob very well. He's been over here several times, but sadly he's stranded over there at the moment. But he's very keen to talk to us tonight. Bob he's a professor in the International Development Studies at Dalhousie. And like me, he comes from a sort of geography development studies background, focusing particularly on developing countries. In his case, he's focused a lot on Cuba. His PhD was on Cuba. He wrote a book on Cuba's health system, and he's done work recently on Cuban medical internationalism. The broader field of interest is health and development. He's written a number of papers on international health electives and issues of global citizenship. He's done some fascinating work also on North Korea. When he was here a couple of years ago, he was really into his work on North Korea. And I must say, it was absolutely fascinating talking to him about that. And another interest of his is sport and development. Most recently, he's done some quite innovative things. He's set up a thing called the Global Development Primer, which is a series of podcasts, and a number of us across the world have recorded these podcasts for Bob, and apparently they're very heavily used by students in Canada particularly, but I think also wider afield. And then with the COVID pandemic that we're all faced with at the moment, he's launched a course called Pandemic the Class, which is, again, is proving to be incredibly popular. It's all about, it's an online course on managing pandemics through cooperation and collaboration. And his latest research, which we're going to hear about tonight, is focusing on the issue of stigma associated with the COVID pandemic. But he's doing some very interesting work in Nova Scotia, looking, for example, how Asians in the Nova Scotian society are facing stigma associated with this COVID. So I think we're in for a really interesting lecture tonight. It's focusing largely on understanding the consequences of stigma from COVID-19. So there he is. Hello, Bob. Come on in. Right.
Hello, Dunedin. Always a pleasure.
Welcome to Otago University. I'm going to hand over to you, Bob.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much, Tony, for a fantastic introduction. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this evening or very early morning, as it is here in Nova Scotia. It would be absolutely wonderful to be back in Otago to join you, but as you know, the pandemic has made things challenging. So tonight, if you allow me, I will take you through what Tony said about research issues on stigma. So let me just see here. Can everyone see the screen? Just a quick hands up. You're all good? Okay, awesome. Great. And this will be the 2020 McKinlay Oration for the Otago Global Health Institute 13th annual conference. Now, Jackie may have been following some of you around with these little QR codes. And if you've got the time and if you've got your phone, just take a shot or open up your camera device and take a shot of this QR code. It will take you to a survey that if you're able to do while I'm speaking to you, we can engage with some of the results in a little bit. If you don't have a phone with a QR code reading camera, just head to menti.com and the code there is 280406 and 1. And if you need some help with that, Jackie can help you out there. I'll leave the code up here. You can even aim your phone at the screen and it should take you to the survey. So as Tony said, this evening, I would like to talk about stigma, and that related to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is the elephant that is in all of our rooms around the world. And it raises questions about how we as a global society are experiencing this totally universal phenomena and how we're experiencing it in profoundly different ways. So some people are faring very well. Some people have the means and resources to get through this, others less so, and others have been targeted by the measures that we put in place to try to abate the virus. So these are the things I want to get to. But as I say, everyone is experiencing this in completely different ways. And the one individual on the planet who's experienced the COVID-19 pandemic in probably the most profoundly different way ever would be the 45th president of the United States, Donald Trump, whose lucid prophecy on COVID-19 reminds us of the following things: that it's, as he said, it affects virtually nobody. As he said, it's an amazing thing. I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute. Is there a way we can do something by giving people an injection? He doesn't like wearing masks in case there's an event where he has to meet a dictator in the Oval Office. And when he actually had COVID himself, he said that a total and complete sign-off from the White House doctors, that means that I can't get COVID-19 and that he's immune to it. And, you know, very, very nice to know, as Donald Trump says. Twitter flagged that as being misleading information. And today, the United States hit a new milestone with over 10 million cases of COVID-19 in that one country, which is 1/5 of all of the COVID-19 cases on the planet. During the rallies that took place during the presidential campaign, we see a very, very different phenomenon about how these two leaders, these two candidates, worked together during this time in terms of raising votes. You had Donald Trump, whose tendency to have mass rallies shoulder to shoulder had nothing to do with social distancing, while Joe Biden had drive-in rallies and encouraged mask wearing and this sort of thing. So one absolutely shunned the public health measures at every turn, to which he himself contracted the virus. And the other, in 2020, there was more cases of COVID-19 actually in the White House in October of 2020 than there were in all of New Zealand. And even New Zealand's uptick of 25 new cases still was dwarfed by the White House's 36 new cases that took place there. So make sure that you're getting my screen here. Yeah, you should be fine. Okay. So we've got two very, very different characters who ran in the US presidential election. And now that Mr. Biden has been elected president-elect, we should expect a very different approach to the pandemic in the US from at least the top office. But mind you, it's a very low bar to jump. from what was presented over the last year from Donald Trump. Nature, a scientific magazine, rarely chimes in on politics, but in this case, they actually have a recent article out that shows the 4 ways in which Donald Trump himself has rolled back the ability to deal with the virus in the United States. And so this is the scientists coming in and saying that by Trump's leadership in the White House, it actually caused catastrophic results for the American population. By attempting to silence scientists, by ignoring advice, especially related to social distancing, mask wearing, and cruise ships, to delay public health reports coming out, and attempting to prematurely authorize cures that had not been scientifically tested. So that's the scientific critique against Trump's leadership. I'm very concerned with the social science critique of Trump's leadership here, and by extension, how other leaders in the world have dealt with COVID-19 pandemic. As for social science, Mr. Trump, when he took to the podium, spread hatred and misinformation with impunity. And now, with the bad apple out of the bunch, hopefully we can, rest assured. But what's going to be the lingering result of this? I mean, Mr. Trump, even when he was at the podium, right, even though his aides had put in his speaking notes, as you can see here, to use the word coronavirus, he himself took a Sharpie across it and wrote in the word Chinese. From the highest office in the United States, there was stigmatization right away. But again, now Mr. Biden is not of the same sort of character, and now the United States will enter into an era of global leadership where other leaders have taken the COVID-19 pandemic seriously. But there still stands a risk. There still stands a risk that is always about investing too much in the characters of our leaders, and rather than the consistent work that's necessary at a community level to make sure that society itself is embracing kindness. Now, here in Canada, there's been many cases that we've seen kindness fall far too short, especially when it comes to the impact on Asian Canadians or persons who appear to be of Asian descent. This story here that Vancouver one was punched for sneezing. It was a latest racist attack in the city of Vancouver. There's other cases that I'll get to, but it is a global phenomenon, including that of New Zealand, where there's been dozens of complaints to the Human Rights Commission about COVID-19 racism during the pandemic, and mostly targeted at Asian Kiwis. And of course, in the United States, and with the advent of cell phones, we're able to witness events like this, where we see this individual here who was sprayed with Febreze on the New York subway system, to which the police later launched an investigation. But this is one account against Asian Americans with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, extending this, while in the early parts of the pandemic, the stigmatization towards persons who appear to be of Asian descent was quite predominant, there's been other forms of stigmatization that have also followed out that are quite interesting. So in Canada, where we have a closed border with the United States, like just to put this in perspective, this is the longest undefended border on the planet, and it's closed. This has never happened before. But as a result of knowing that there's been a lot of uptick of COVID-19 cases in the United States, we've seen various attacks here on this side of the border, such as this individual in Vancouver Island who drove his truck to Canada with Texas license plates and woke up to find his truck graffitied. Now, here where I am in Nova Scotia, which tends to pride itself on being a very friendly place for anyone to visit and enjoy, we've seen similar cases, such as this case here, where we've got this, it's a Honda. I don't know what kind of Honda it is, but upon this Honda, it was there was a letter that said, go home. Now, this Honda belonged to Benjamin Hebb. Now, there's Ben right there. And Ben, as you can see, proud Canadian, proud Nova Scotian, and a proud Ghostbusters fan. He likes Ghostbusters, the movies, which is why he put on the front of his plate Ecto 1. It was a gag license plate that he put on the front of his car, and people started to target his car to say, go back to New York. So we're seeing this in a kind of bizarre way in Canada, but we're also seeing it in a very deadly way in other nations around the world, such as India, where many coronavirus conspiracy theories have been targeting Muslim populations that have led to violence against Muslim communities within India. In South Africa, there have been reports of nurses being physically removed from public transport by members of the public who viewed the nurses as carriers of the coronavirus. So being infected with a disease, with COVID-19, is not a choice, and certainly not something that should be apportioned to blame. Instead, we should see it as a pandemic that requires a fundamental change in actually how we deal with each other. We have a crisis upon a crisis when it comes to this, and there's two ways of going forward. First is understanding what viruses are about, and second, understanding why stigma occurs in the first place. So here's the point. I'm watching the clock here, and I think Jackie's given me just under an hour or so to chat to you about these issues. And I'll say that as Tony mentioned, I do teach a class on pandemic management, and I find that teaching in the online world, sometimes we need just to take a pause. So you'll see some snippets from my class, including some musical interludes. So I hope this will be an enjoyable time for the next hour or so. So my point is, in case you have to scootle off early, is that handling the COVID-19 pandemic has required using ancient methods like quarantine and self-isolation, shelter in place, whatever you want to call it. This is not really advanced public health methodology. This is incredibly old. And with these ancient methods come about ancient problems. And I want to talk about that. And as the pandemic is continuing to unfold, success and failure has often been measured in terms of national successes, national levels, about bringing about competition and even rising nationalisms between what were, up until a year ago, very open borders that people didn't really seem to notice as much. But COVID-19 puts global health itself at a crossroads of either entrenching inward nationalisms or building international cooperation. And there's some historical elements I want to get to in this. But to achieve the later, to achieve this idea of international cooperation in the time of a pandemic, we may need to follow the example of some countries in the global south in how they have managed the pandemic based on best practices, cooperation, community support, and outreach. And this is something that could be a very important shift in global health, where we don't turn to London and we don't turn to Washington for best practices and policy going forward. We look to see how nations and communities around the world have managed to take care of each other. So, the coronavirus, COVID-19. As was written in The Economist in the August 22nd edition, they had a great write-up here that said that humans think of themselves as the world's apex predators, which hence the silence of the saber-toothed tigers and why there's no moas in New Zealand, and the long list of endangered megafauna have departed us. But the COVID-19 virus shows how people can also end up as victims. Viruses have caused a litany of modern pandemics, from COVID-19 to HIV/AIDS to the influenza outbreak in 1918 and 1920, which killed many more people than the First World War. Now, before that, colonization of the Americas by Europeans was abetted and perhaps even made possible, as the geographer George Lovell argues, by epidemics and by smallpox, measles, and influenza, brought unwittingly by the invaders, which annihilated many of the original inhabitants. In many ways, viruses are the apex predator on this planet. They kill more living things than any other organism. And humans, we're lucky to live about 100 years. Oak trees may live 1,000, mayflies, maybe a day. But they all are alive in the same way. They're made up of cells which embody flows of energy and stores of information. Their metabolisms make up use of that energy, be it from sunlight or from food. They build new molecules, they break down old molecules, they use mechanisms described in the genes, they inherit it and may or may not pass on. And then there are viruses. In viruses, the link between metabolism and genes that binds together all life to which you're related is broken. Viral genes have no cells, they have no bodies, they have no metabolism of their own. The tiny particles, virions, in which these genes come packaged, the dot-studded discs of the coronavirus, as you can see here, are entirely inanimate. An individual animal or plant embodies and maintains a restless metabolism. But a virion is just, well, it's an arrangement of matter. And the virus has no plan and it has no desire. Its simplest purpose is the simplest on the planet, to maintain the difference between what is inside the cell and what is outside of it, to move towards one chemical or away from another, or entirely beyond it. It copies itself in whatever way it does, simply because it has copied itself that way before in other cells, in other hosts. And because the virus has no plan, this is why it matters enormously for society to have a plan with dealing with a virus. Wash your hands, stay at home, practice social distancing. They're all the key public health messages to slow a pandemic. And none of this is new. And really, none of this is about health. It's about combating a virus. And it's an important distinction to make between combating a virus or promoting health of a society. When you look at the upstream determinants of health versus the downstream determinants of health, we see a big difference here. That some of the public health messaging, the safety measures that have been brought out by governments around the world are usually very downstream to that of individual lifestyle factors, about how to go to work, how to stay at home, how to socially distance, how to wash your hands. Okay, but then upstream, a lot of the success of that depends on the economic, social, and cultural environmental conditions in which people live, work, play, and breathe. So when you've got proper housing and you're able to manage that's helpful. Water and sanitation, also helpful. Unemployment is incredibly important in times of a pandemic. If people are told to not go to work, or the service industry is told to not open their doors to customers, if there's no employment insurance within that nation, it's not going to be as easy to maintain those practices as a country that does provide social services and social benefit for those citizens. So much of the advice given is about limiting the spread of the virus. And the question then is, can it be possible to address the virus while ensuring health for all, while making sure that everyone is taken care of, that the other health issues in our world don't stop? And on that note, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if we've got the tools. I'm not sure if we've got the historical legacy or the emotional intelligence to get through it, or if society is actually up for it. But what I do know is that the more pandemic advice is focused on restricting the virus, rather than ensuring the health for all, there are going to be consequences in society. And one of which is stigma. So here in Nova Scotia, the rule of the game is if you leave Nova Scotia, you have to isolate yourself by yourself, likely in commercial accommodation, when you return into the province. But what we've got here in the Atlantic bubble in Canada is a very different message from other parts of North America. And as a result, even this simple thing, just to self-isolate, has caused quite a bit of stigmatization against people who are unable to practice that. Now, self-isolation, quarantine, this is not new. Like it's old. It's really old. It's like Book of Leviticus old, like Old Testament. Leviticus 13:46, as long as they have the disease, they remain unclean. They must live alone. They must live outside the camp. Leviticus 13:52, he shall therefore burn the garment in which is the plague, whether warp or woof or wool and linen or anything in leather, for its active leprosy, the garment shall be burned in the fire. Very old methods that were repeated and varied even during the bubonic plague of the medieval times. In the 14th century in Europe, physicians relied on crude and unsophisticated techniques such as bloodletting and boil lancing, practices that were dangerous as well as unsanitary, and superstitious practice such as burning aromatic herbs and bathing in rosewater and vinegar to get rid of plague. And meanwhile, in a panic, healthy people did all they could to avoid being sick. The doctors refused to see patients, priests refused to administer last rites, and shopkeepers closed their stores. Many people fled the cities for the countryside, but even there, they could not escape the disease, because it affected cows, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens, as well as people. And in fact, so many died that one of the consequences of Black Death was actually a European wool shortage from the mortality of sheep. Many people, desperate to save themselves, even abandoned their sick and dying loved ones. And thus doing, each thought to secure immunity for themselves. In 1665, in the village of Yem in England, the history of plague showed up there. After, in 1665, a flea-infested bundle of cloth arrived from London to the local tailor. And as the disease spread, the villagers turned to leadership from the rector, who was a Reverend William Mompesson, and the ejected Puritan minister Thomas Stanley. They introduced a number of precautions to slow the spread of illness from May of 1666, and the measures included arrangements that families were to bury their dead and relocation of church services to the natural amphitheater. But many also agreed with the idea of isolating themselves in, essentially building a wall around the village so that the plague couldn't come in. But the plague ran its course over 14 months as it came in by rats and mice and not by people. So the self-isolated village killed at least 260 villagers, with only 83 surviving out of a population of 350, not knowing the disease was spread by vermin. And the barred fences did nothing to help with the village. In fact, it intensified it. So these are the old ways of self-isolation. They had problems then. Even when vaccines were introduced, there were still controversies. Fast forward to the age of vaccines, and new challenges come with new methods. So this is Oswaldo Cruz, who was the Brazilian physician and public health officer who sought universal vaccination in Brazil between 1904 and 1908. And during that time, by the thousands, Brazilians were dying of the disease of smallpox. And while doctors were bleeding the morbid and healers were scaring off the plague with smoldering cow dung, Oswaldo Cruz, in charge of public health, decided to make vaccination obligatory for everyone in Brazil. Challenging this was Senator Rui Barbosa, who was a pigeon-chested and smooth-tongued orator who attacked vaccination using juridical weapons that were flowery with adjectives. In the name of liberty, Rui Barbosa defended the right of every individual to be contaminated with smallpox if he so desires. Torrential applause through the legislature. Ovations interrupted him from phrase to phrase. The politicians began to oppose vaccination in Brazil, then the doctors and the journalists. And every newspaper began to carry choleric editorials and cruel caricatures, victimizing Oswaldo Cruz. He could not show his face in any street with having insults and stones thrown at him. So the whole country of Brazil closed rank against vaccination on all sides. The legislation was defeated in 1908. Down with vaccination is heard, and against vaccination, the cadets of the military camp, the military academy, rose in arms and just missed overthrowing the president. But in 1908, smallpox took Rio de Janeiro, as Oswaldo Cruz had predicted, where 9,000 people died within a single month, to which Cruz set up vaccination posts across the city, and people rushed to them en masse. Essentially, when a society is dealing with a health issue that it doesn't fully understand, there's going to be reactions. And much of the advice given out today about COVID-19 is about limiting the spread of the virus. And the question then is, can it be possible to address the virus while ensuring health for all? And on that note, again, I said, I'm not fully sure. And part of that uncertainty, I think, extends from maybe we don't know how to define health, right? How would you define health? If you've got your phone with you, because I know you've scanned that QR code, you could look up the definition of health on your phone dictionary, and you might get something like this: the state of being free from illness or injury is one definition of health. Now, this is usually how medical schools begin to approach what health is: being free from something, not having illness or injury. And that's slightly problematic from the point of view of writing dictionaries. Because if you were to look up the definition of an apple, you would find that it would be a very detailed definition. The round fruit of a tree of the rose family, which typically has thin green or red skin and crisp flesh. If you were to buy a dictionary and it said that the definition of an apple is not an orange, you'd probably leave the dictionary on the shelf, because dictionaries are not supposed to define something for which they're not. And yet, when you look at the various definitions of health, 1 and 3 come from biology textbooks, 2 and 4 come from medical textbooks. We see that this is often the starting point about ridding people from injury or illness. Very little policy, even though at the higher levels it's talked about quite profusely, about a state of complete mental and social well-being is actually imposed for all. Some people will benefit, others won't. And that, I think, is the issue. The final definition, number 5 there, is the World Health Organization definition, state of complete mental and social well-being. So let's just have a peek at that survey. How are we all doing here? The 25 of you, thanks for participating. You guys are, you're rock stars. I love it. Thank you so much indeed. So we're here, and as you can see, the survey here is that a lot of people who've provided feedback feel that New Zealand has done well. This is at the top. Then Canada, then Cuba, Sierra Leone, India, and the United States is down here in 6th place in terms of dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's good. Let's come back to that in a minute. Feel free to chime in if you can. Now, I think a lot of the praise that's come to places like New Zealand and to an extent Canada has been from closing borders, from isolation of population. The team of 5 million. God, I love that. That's a man who came up with that. That's the right stuff. I love it. And part of that also comes from a history of pandemics, where we go back to the case of Samoa, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, about the division of Samoa between the New Zealand governed side back after World War I to that of the American side, where, of course, the New Zealand side allowed vessels such as the Loon, this vessel here, to enter ports, wound up spreading influenza during that time to an absolutely devastating effect. 22% of the population of Samoa died within 2 months. It's 38,000 people who succumbed to influenza, whereas the American side at the time did not allow vessels to come in and remained free of influenza during that time of the pandemic. Now, that's often cited, and still to the day, sort of an older method, this is not new, about restricting movement as being able to then restrict the virus. You stop moving the virus, you've effectively rid the virus altogether. And we see that after the New Zealand example, other countries around the world followed suit back in 1918. Here in the city of Kelowna, British Columbia, and interior British Columbia, social restrictions were put in place, prohibitions of movement were put in place. And we also see other cases where here at the border, this rendition of the border between Italy and Switzerland during the time of the influenza shows an Italian camp with Swiss occupants that were quarantined just in the border regions there. So the idea about isolating and restricting movements and travel could, there was merit to it in 1918, and still we've seen some efficacy today. It's still regarded as some of the best practices in pandemic management, but the challenges have gotten harder. And the challenges have gotten harder is because we're not rolling around the world in steamships. We're cruising in Emirates A380s, which can transport 615 people from Dubai to pretty much any airport on Earth within 15 hours. I mean, if there's ever a symbol of globalization, this is it. And the airlines have come under very heavy scrutiny for their internal hygiene standards and worries about virus transmission. I mean, to the point where Emirates themselves will pay for your funeral if you succumb to COVID-19 having taken one of their flights. Admittedly, the new cleaning practices on aircraft, I think, actually calls into question just how low the bar was pre-pandemic. So that also bears reflection on some of the ancient approaches, not just to pandemic management, but to airline hygiene. And I bring this in for a good reason, that this is not a new idea that's been kicked around, that in fact, in 1933 to 1935, the League of Nations International Sanitary Convention for Aerial Navigation dealt with exactly this issue, that there was a worry that air transport was going to have the capacity to speed up global transmission of viruses around the world. So the airlines, again, have come under scrutiny, but this conversation started in the 1930s. Now, before planes and before steam, in the age of sail, it was actually difficult to get anywhere in the planet in under 14 days between international ports, excluding Europe, of course. So that in itself puts you in a 14-day self-isolation. If there was disease on board, 14 days or so at sea or being in anchorage would take care of it. But the age of steam sped it up greatly, and hence the story of the 1918 to 1920 influenza outbreak around the world. And the steam carriers were able to move faster and quicker and carry people with them to other ports. So when it came to the age of aircraft, the League of Nations Health Committee became greatly concerned. To quote, to say that sanitary aerodromes shall at all time have at their disposal an organized medical service with one medical officer at least and one more sanitary inspector for each flight. It being understood that this staff will not necessarily be in permanent attendance in the aerodrome, but there should be a place for medical inspection, equipment for taking and dispatching suspected material, an examination, and have a laboratory within reasonable distance, have facilities in the case of necessity for the isolation, transport, and care of the sick, for the isolation of contacts separately from the sick, and for carrying out any other prophylactic measures in suitable premises, either within the aerodrome or in proximity to it. The apparatus necessary for carrying out disinfection, desinsectization, and deratization if required, as well as any other measure laid down in the present convention. The aerodrome shall be provided with a sufficient supply of wholesome drinking water and with a proper and safe system for the disposal of excreta and refuse for the removal of wastewater. The aerodrome shall, as far as possible, be protected from rats. Well, that's nice. But the idea is that the original idea of airports wasn't about, having shopping malls within inside of them, that it was originally about setting them up as first line medical inspection, almost like mini hospitals and quarantine facilities. That was the concern. And as we know, this was not followed at all. And it was not followed because of absolute colonial hubris. If I may quote the American Journal of Public Health editorial board in 1933 to say that so far we've been able to overcome the principal diseases found in the trade routes of the world, and there is little doubt that we will accomplish the same with respect to airplane travel, because until now the limitations and expense of traveling by airplane have been such to limit the risks. In that, and here we go, this is direct quote right from the page, editorial board 1933, because only the richer and better class of people as a rule travel by airplane. So there's no need for such measures to be imposed. It would surprise no one, however, to see air travel become much cheaper through the introduction of planes that could carry 100 passengers or more. So it is high time for us to go beyond regarding the airplane as a curiosity and a wonder, and to recognize that it's come to be a mainstay of transportation. However, as we see now, with here is the scene in Halifax. This is the quarantine inspection at Halifax Airport. It's some leftover card tables and a luggage cart with a sign. And this is what we have, because the idea of actually ensuring health or dealing with viruses was forgotten in airport design for about a good 70 years. And now we're cracking out the card tables and getting people to come over and fill out forms. So in Canada, this is really telling, because I see from the survey, Canada is ranking fairly high in your opinions, but Canada's a tricky place, because when it comes to healthcare, there's not just one Canada, there's 13 Canadas. Health is the business of the provinces, not the nation. So Ottawa, the capital, can give advice, but it's up to each province to deal with health in their own way. So what's actually happening here is a reimagination of nationalisms, even within the country. If you roll back to some of the work that Benedict Anderson did in the 1980s, his monumental book on imagined communities, where he argued that nations were a socially constructed community that were imagined by people who perceive themselves to be part of a group. And it's imagined because the members, even in the smallest nation, Pitcairn excluded, will never know most of their fellow members, meet them, or even hear from them. Yet in the minds of each lives the image of the communion of each other. So even though compatriots will not know each other, you'll never meet everyone in the team of 5 million, they may hold in their minds a mental image of their affinity. For example, the nationhood felt when other members of your own nation, when your imagined community participates in a larger event with success, such as the Olympics, such as the war, or actions against the pandemic. And what we're seeing here are the all-stars of Canada. No, it's not a hockey team. These are the public health officers from Ottawa there, Theresa Tam in the top left, and then the other provinces, as you can see here. These guys and gals are rock stars in terms of public support for the measures that they've taken. But here we've got a country that is based on 13 interlocking systems to develop standards, agree on policy, and yet allow for regional differences. And most nations of equal-sized populations can't pull this off. So we see now that there's borders between provinces, which we've never seen before. We've seen mandatory quarantines between provinces. That's new. And here in Nova Scotia, we've actually seen probably one of the best controlled measures of COVID-19 anywhere in the country. Again, returning to Nova Scotia, you must self-isolate. That said, the broader challenges of stigmatization still exist, not just here in Canada, but also to the United States, referring back to Donald Trump here, of course. There's a great report done in National Geographic that came out about America's long history of scapegoating to its Asian citizens, about how many people in the United States were blaming Asian Americans or people who appeared to be of Asian descent for the virus. A very telling photo here from that report that as news of COVID-19 began ramping up in January, Carlin Chan heard rumors in Chinatown of residents being harassed. So he started patrolling the streets of his neighborhood to make sure residents felt safe. He posted about his patrols on social media, and dozens of people began walking with him. And as you can see, the photos in this photo journeys just show the kind of stigma that was given to a man who appeared to be of Asian descent walking through a public eating area. The quiet, but yet menacing, lewd stares, I suppose. It's led the CDC to have the Center for Disease Control in the United States, to have a whole program on reducing stigma. That's part of it. And other countries as well have been dealing with this. We've seen reports from Australia about Asian Australians threatened and spat on and racist incidents amid coronavirus. Some 377 incidents of anti-Asian racism in 2 months took place. Of course, in New Zealand, Human Rights Commission launches a new campaign after Asian discrimination reports during the COVID pandemic. And anti-Asian hate crime incidents were up 878% in Vancouver compared to the year before. And what we're seeing is that while there was quite a focus on Asian Americans or Asian Canadians or people who appear to be of Asian descent, it's now spread to other groups, right? So if you appear to be from America and coming up into Canada, you will probably be punished for that. If you are a nurse, you will be punished for that. Or the family of a nurse or an essential worker, you may find that society will punish you through jaded comments, stigmatization, isolation, you name it. And I think part of it is also to slightly blame towards Hollywood, where if you look at how the manifestation of pop culture around pandemics is played out, it's usually the lone survivor up against all, that most people aren't going to make it, but that one individual will. So taken together, as I said, the virus has no plan, it has no desire, which is why our plans matter. And not just in the fight against it, but in how we really do take care of each other. If we organize in a way that divides us and others us, the virus wins. Making people based on their identity feel vulnerable and intimidated, while then encouraging other groups to defy social ordinances, gives the virus incredible advantage. For example, a shoulder-to-shoulder Trump rally, which are lily white, and the crowd attendees are shoulder-to-shoulder chanting China virus and Kung flu, that gives COVID-19 the advantage. So all that we know about stigma, right, that comes from the top orders of World Health Organization and good government policy about people who are likely to be stigmatized during this event, ways to try to share facts, to try to adopt protective measures, to use inclusive language, to bust myths, to reorient how we're actually doing. These are all steps in the right direction, but is it enough? So let's just check in on that survey again to see how we're doing. And there we go, 27. So when it comes to stigma, just for the last little bit of my discussion with you folks here, let's actually check in on these nations to see how they're doing. And again, I'm getting a little bit dry in the throat, so I may throw in some musical interludes or some media clips with this. So New Zealand's in first place for handling the pandemic, and by gar, I think that's deserved. I think that's all right. But how is New Zealand doing when it comes to stigma, or just how's New Zealand faring overall? As we see here, I'm sure you remember this video clip.
Look at the rest of the world. You know, they were trying to say, oh, we weren't doing. Now all of a sudden, a lot of the places that they were using to hold up, they're having a big surge. They're having and I don't want that. I don't want that. But they were holding up names of countries, and now they're saying, whoops. In fact, even New Zealand, you see what's going on in New Zealand. They beat it. They beat it. It was like front page. They beat it because they wanted to show me something. The problem is big surge in New Zealand. So, you know, it's terrible.
Obviously, I don't think there's any comparison between New Zealand's current cluster and the tens of thousands of cases that are being seen daily in the United States. Obviously, every country is experiencing its own fight with COVID-19. It is a tricky virus, but not one where I would compare New Zealand's current status to the United States. Look, I think for anyone...
And rightly so. I mean, New Zealand has done a fantastic job in dealing with this. And what we've seen here, especially from the leadership in New Zealand, is not just about closing borders and ports or you know, as you can tune into the GDP podcast and hear about Tony Binns's time in quarantine. It's about using inclusive language, which I will come back to at the very end of this and say that this is something on behalf of scholars and policymakers in New Zealand to make that voice louder, because the world needs to hear how it's done, to try to see how inclusivity can take place in action. And still, as it is occurring, it doesn't mean that the job is done. There still continues to be reports from the New Zealand Human Rights Commission about continued complaints that are received about discrimination against people to be of Asian descent in New Zealand. And again, you've got the comment section down here that can continue to perpetuate that. Some of the campaigns that are going on in New Zealand, again, top rate ways of trying to connect with people in terms of not just ordering them.
Kia ora. Since the start of the pandemic, there's been a huge wave of people blaming Asian New Zealanders for everything that's going on. Look, I get it. You're scared. We all are. You're scared you and your family are going to catch the virus. You're scared you're going to lose your job. You're scared it's not going to go away anytime soon. It's a scary time, and you might feel like you need to find someone to blame for it. But just stop and think for a second. Do you really think that Helen from your office purposely brought COVID here from China? No, of course not. She was at a cafe having overpriced smashed avo just like everyone else. Also, she's Korean. She's never even been to China. And even if she had, that's irrelevant, all right? Just leave her alone. Look, what I'm trying to say is, everyone is having a hard time at the moment, and blaming innocent Asian New Zealanders who are just trying to live their life isn't going to make that go away. We're all in the same boat. Let's look out for each other. Racism. It's no joke.
So again, I think that's kind of inclusive ways of dealing with stigma, right? But it's not enough to just say we've done this once and that's it. It's got to be a continuous process. The survey says that Canada has done well. Well, let's check in on Canada again. Welcome, bienvenue, Pujasla from Mi'kmaqi here in Nova Scotia. How has Canada done? Well, we were doing okay. And then as I say here in Nova Scotia, then the arse came out of her. We were pretty much on track in the summertime, June and July and August, especially being next to the world's largest area of COVID-19. But then in Quebec in the fall, we lost it. And it's spiking about 1,000+ cases a day there, which means that provinces like mine here in Nova Scotia, which continue to be flat, are locking down more and more. And the thing is about looking at Canada, we can't actually look at it as one nation. We've got to look at it by region. And we'll talk about that. But I think that these policies and ordinances here, some of them have been more stigmatizing and some have not. And the ones here in Nova Scotia, the stricter ones, indeed have been. So this is our Premier McNeil.
It means staying home.
Please keep up your physical distance.
And stay home as much as possible.
The message? Well, it's for everyone's own good, if not a tad repetitive. But in Nova Scotia, just as people might have been lulled into complacency, came this little gem from Premier Stephen McNeil.
When all we have to do is stay the blazes home.
It sounded kind of cross. But look at what is normally Halifax's busiest downtown street. Hardly a soul. That scolding might just be getting through to people.
What did the Premier say to do?
Stay the blazes home!
Stay the blazes home.
And then, amid all this isolation, you guessed it.
Stay the blazes home, stay the blazes home. Think about the common good, stay the blazes home.
The songwriters took over, in this case, the Stanfield.
If you got the inkling, you want to go to town, remember there's a nasty bug going around.
And they weren't the only ones. Merchandise started popping up, t-shirts and the like, with profits going to the food bank.
Stevie boy, stay the blazes home. Stay the blazes.
But more than just a lark, as this pandemic grinds on and the messaging becomes more critical, this kind of thing can actually be good.
You got to find a way to break through that 20 to 30,000 messages of clutter we get each day.
Business professor Ed McHugh told us, from his home of course, that the Premier was able to punch through.
I watched and I immediately went, he's got it. I said, that was it. It clicked for me, and it clicked for a lot of people. You got to find something that stands out, and it's even what works best is slightly tongue-in-cheek. That works better than the straight scientific information that we get, right now every single day.
If you got the hankering to go and get your fix, to party with your buddies and drink a beer or six.
Now, in Nova Scotia, there are no kitchen parties allowed at this time, social distancing and all. But there's a beer, further evidence that this catchphrase is really catching on.
It's okay to find the humor in these words. After all, we could all use a bit of humor now. But it's very important that people understand and heed the message behind the words.
A potentially effective message that may help ward off the virus, and a little creativity to deal with that cabin fever. Tom Murphy, CBC News, Halifax.
So there we go. We get a bit of a scolding from like your principal to say, stay the blazes home. And it's caught on. But in that's okay if you're part of the club, because part of the policy here in Nova Scotia was, again, bubbling, so that people who were not identified as living here, well, they became targeted. And we're starting to see greater evidence of that. So again, our pal here, Benjamin Hebb, who is a big Ghostbusters fan, he got a note on his car. So let me talk to you about what I've had to do to mine. So just to give you an example from my own personal life here in Nova Scotia, we've been very fortunate during the COVID-19 pandemic to have very low case counts, very low mortality, because we all take precautions, such as wearing masks. We all have to do that. And even with a bit of pride, having the Nova Scotia tartan on the mask. But so too have I had to take precautions when driving around this province, because this vehicle here, which is in desperate need of a bath, has license plates from the Garden State. And as people have taken notice of New Jersey plates here in Nova Scotia, there's been quite a consistent and frequent bombardment of harassment, from microaggressions in grocery stores to outright confrontations in other parking lots to physical altercations on the edge of breaking out. So some of the precautions we've had to take were to put the home sticker on here to remind people that in fact we live here, and even the Medicare for All sticker, something to remind the good people of Nova Scotia that we share this value of Medicare, not like Mr. Trump would believe. So again, this car and myself have been here for the entirety of the pandemic, but even one step further is that I wound up getting a Nova Scotia license plate flag to put on top of what was the New Jersey license plate, because in Nova Scotia you only have to have a back plate. So when I back the car into a parking lot hiding the back plate, I hope that the Nova Scotia plate deters some of the more frequent harassment that has been occurring during this pandemic. So as the days go on here in Nova Scotia, we hear the Premier and the Chief Health Officer continue to talk to us every day about updates with COVID-19. But what we don't hear is the underlying stories about how people are not doing well during this time. So they get up there, they do their thing, and they kind of reminiscent of this. And it's cute. This is actually a local tongue-in-cheek joke about the Premier and the Public Health Officer here. But what we do hear more about now that we've got the Nova Scotia COVID Stigma survey on now about people who identify as Asian, people who live outside of the Atlantic bubble, people who have to travel for work, their experiences, we're starting to get some pretty disturbing cases about just how the community is behaving towards these groups of people. The other group, and that's where we'll leave that stigma is definitely occurring here. Now, the other group that has fared well on your survey is, of course, Cuba. And as Tony mentioned, I've got a real fond affection for Cuba. So let's see how they're doing, and let's listen to some music.
Para ser exacto, de Cheguam, donde están los de la nueva generación. Son y mira, ponte en el fuego de la acción, con presión de la lírica, mística, psíquica. La rumba ha comenzado con Anga, Franco Pro, el negro Yoruba, hijo de Legua, Candela. Escucha cómo suena, no hay más nada. Sonido fuerte, ardiente y pegajoso. Sinceroso te destrozo. Mi flow que calma sin fatiga a los nerviosos. Con mi conexión, controlando bien mi lengua. Pegado hasta el techo, quiero que lo entiendas. Botella, ron, tabaco, habano.
And there we go. Now, Cuba has done very well for containing COVID-19 within its own borders, but it's also sent its own health workers abroad. And that is something that no other country has done in the same way, where you've got hundreds of Cuban doctors that have provided care, as you can see from that map that popped up there, to both rich countries and poor countries alike. So here's the delegation arriving. I believe this is in Angola. And we've got here even some First Nations chiefs in Canada asking the federal government to allow Cuban doctors to come in to help the cause. This is a convoy of cruise ship passengers that are taken to a quarantine and treatment facility within Havana after their cruise ship was basically left adrift at sea when no other nation would bring them in. Now, Cuba's got a long history of medical internationalism. I don't have time to get into it tonight. But one thing is for sure is that it's the only nation that said, right, we are going to put our public health work in place at home and in a way that can also help others abroad. That, I believe, is completely exceptional, especially when Cuba's economy is absolutely in the basket. You've got queues like this for foodstuffs. You've got shortages abounding. it's not easy at home when you've also got the realization that you're helping all these countries around the world, and yet at home you can barely get enough groceries on the table. That's caused some tension. So much so that the Cuban government is even thinking about reevaluating its currencies as a result of the pandemic. Now, good for you, conference attendees, for putting Sierra Leone where you did. I couldn't agree more with your positioning on this one. Sierra Leone has done incredibly well during the pandemic. It's had very, very low case counts. Initially, there was some reports in medical journals to say that they were trying to attribute it to the lack of COVID-19 due to biological resistance of the region. As we see here, very low cases. And then someone said, hold on, we've seen pandemics before in West Africa. We know what we're doing. And sure enough, that's the case, right? You've had, as the coronavirus spread in January, you've had top-level officials in Sierra Leone meet with other international experts to get a pandemic plan in place, to figure out public education strategies, to figure out quarantine measures, to think about travel plans between districts. In fact, it's very, very extensive. And also combined with that, having gone through the Ebola epidemic in 2014, conscious effort towards stigmatization, right? The Ebola workers themselves had figured this. You see that in Sierra Leone, this is actually part of the package. The former director of Liberia's Public Health Institute says that the U.S. Center for Disease Control had actually helped to teach health officials in the region the methods during the public health outbreak. And the thing is, that teaching was very much a part of the President Obama playbook for pandemics, the copy that Trump never got. So, fun fact, that when word broke out among some of the diplomats in West Africa that they're using the U.S. playbook, and look, the cases are surging in the U.S. where this thing doesn't work. Someone said, well, actually, no, the U.S. isn't actually using it themselves. So just keep going, business as usual. And they did. And there's certainly concern for increased uptake. There's resource shortfalls. There's serious issues in Sierra Leone that by putting in lockdowns and restrictions and curfews, you're really digging into people's livelihoods, right? And this is a very risky and challenging thing to do, especially in times of when there's no social assistance or social services available there. And finally, we won't get too much into it, but India has imposed some of the world's strictest COVID-19 measures anywhere in the world, some 40 days of lockdown that was combined for more weeks on top of it. And again, with something where there's a lot of mistrust going on within India using social media that blames the COVID-19 pandemic on Muslim minority communities throughout the country. There's been evidence of police assisting in the violence that's been targeted against Muslim Indians, and this again is a really grave condition of it, but again couched in the idea of nationalism, that in this case, as much as we've seen nationalism take on its forms, either as a form of pride or a form of whatever, India wound up targeting their minorities. And finally, in last place is the United States, and no better way to describe it about how culture has been in the US than this clip.
Making your way in the world today takes everything you've got. Taking a break from all your worries sure would help a lot. Wouldn't you like to get away?
You guys are violating federal law. Get that?
Sometimes you wanna go where everybody knows your name. And they're always glad you came. You wanna be where you can see our troubles are all the same. You wanna be where everybody knows your name. You wanna go where people know people are all the same. You wanna go where everybody knows your name.
It hasn't been a good time in the United States for the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, a gentleman here who was Febrezed on a New York subway, people storming Walmarts to not wear masks, open defiance of the mask orders. And now, on his way out, we've got one more concern to deal with here, is that we can see quite much on a global scale just how out of touch the United States is. But the problem is that you did have 71 million people who are actively supporting and venerating the last 4 years there, which was against 76 million people on the other side. That is a cause for concern. That is something that I believe is worrisome, and that means the work isn't over yet. So final words. I know I've gone a little bit over time here. Do apologize for that. And we'll just wrap it up. But on stigma and the pandemic, regardless of how well or how poorly a country has fared in handling COVID-19, cases, stigma, othering, and nationalism are going to remain a challenge. And depending on the governance at the top, depending on the actions of the community, and depending on the ability to actually create resilience for people's own health, that is going to matter. Even in countries that celebrate compassion and mindfulness towards stigma at the community level, the attention at the community level matters, not just in combating the virus, but in actually taking care of each other, right? Not othering, not blaming, not doing that kind of event. Cuba and Sierra Leone are both low-income countries, and they have done incredibly well to address the pandemic within their own borders, despite absolutely crippling economic circumstances, and that needs to be noted. And global health has traditionally been about wealthy nations giving poor nations advice. We might be seeing the tides turn on that. So when it comes to health promotion and disease prevention, final thoughts on it, let me provide you with some recommendations about an era when we're using ancient methods in a modern pandemic. First up, if you practice a politics of compassion, be braver than national pride and embrace solidarity to everyone who faces similar challenges. If you choose to live in bubbles, remain inclusive to all who want to be with you. Remember that is the behavior within a community that matters, not the identity bestowed upon people. If you have gone through a horrific epidemic, build, educate, and then rebuild for the next one. And if social media tells you to hate your neighbor, tell it off. Better yet, turn it off. And if you choose to help others going through struggles, remember to take care of yourself in the process. And if you live in a country with a delusional, egotistical, xenophobic racist as a leader, vote him out, because that will improve everyone's health. So I just want to finish up again on one final thing, something that the University of Otago's very own Kevin Clements posted on social media a few weeks back. Kevin said that the old style adversarial politics are not what people want anymore. And most people understand that all of the wicked problems the world faces requires the best minds and expertise available from across the political spectrum. And the task is how to practice the loving, caring politics while being bold, decisive, unpopular when the challenges need immediate, short, and long-term progressive and radical action. I don't think anyone said it better. That was fantastic, Kevin. If you can relay the message to him for that. But that's exactly what our next steps are. This COVID-19 pandemic has been a global experience that conjoins us all. And to get to that state, to find the moments when compassion becomes strength, and the moments when that strength then leads us towards health, rather than just having a fearful fight against the virus, that is going to be the ingredient for global health in the 21st century. So thank you very much, Otago. It is always a pleasure to hang out with you, even if it's through the screen.
Yeah, Bob, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating and totally engaging. We've got a few minutes now for questions. We're going to pass a microphone round, otherwise Bob won't be able to hear you. Would anybody
just
like
as you're doing that, Tony, if I can just jump in. Thank you all for participating in that survey here that I'm sharing with you at the moment. I've got one more for you. So if you are able to use your phone to chime into that QR code. Do it at your leisure, and we'll chat about the results on Twitter down the road. It's just going to ask you to offer a few words about stigma, but I'm happy to hear any questions that the audience has.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thank you. Would anybody like to kick off? Yes, at the back there. Yes. Okay.
Thank you, Bob. It was a very comprehensive, coherent, and very engaging presentation. Thanks for that. Highly informative as well. There is no question, just that coming from India, my thoughts, there was no racist action or racist opinion about Muslims. What India was concerned was, there was this Talbigi Jamaat, which congregated during the pandemic, and it became a hotspot and became cause of 4,000 cases and 27 deaths which were related to it. In spite of this, the congregation did not allow the authorities for quarantining, and they continued to assemble in mosques in spite of spiking pandemic. That was the concern, and the government had to use force as it did with anybody else. So when we are talking on an international platform, it is very important that the hatred message is not sent around.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Bob, do you want to chip in on that?
Yeah, no, that's the spreading of that case is really, you know, as you described. The unfortunate thing that comes with it, though, is how people respond, react to it, or, you know, express their sentiment. And the hard truth is that there's a lot of anti-Muslim sentiment that came through social media and has been echoed in other channels against Muslim communities in India. And this is where it gets tense, because if there's a disobedience of order, you know, where is the policy failing in that? And then how does something in that case then translate into harmful or hurtful reactions? Mm-hmm. And that's where I think, you know, we've got to be better about and try to find ways that avoid that harmful consequence, where people who, you know, are then attacked or profiled based on how they identify as to what the nature of the circumstance was.
Yeah, I'd go along with that. It's very useful to get the more detail from you, though, on this. That's wonderful. Thank you. Can I bring somebody else's? Yeah. Okay, right. Yes, thank you. Could we bring somebody else in?
Kia ora, Bob. Thank you for your presentation. During the lockdown here in New Zealand, we had an item appeared, that went worldwide, called the Great Pause, that was predicated on the belief that the way we were doing things economically and socially was not fit for purpose, and many people were worse off because of the way we design our economy. And the lockdown was a chance for reflection on new ways of doing things. What's the move or the motivation in Canada for, you know, positioning ourselves different going forward?
Yeah, you know, it's a great point. I mean, it's very quick when there's a big change, any change, to say that the economic impacts are going to make us suffer hard, and often that's very prudent caution that gets thrown into these circumstances. What I can speak to here in Nova Scotia is that this is a place where the majority of the economy lies on the fingers on your hand. Number one is public higher education, so foreign students coming to the province. Two is the healthcare sector. Three is lobster. One crustacean is like a foundation for the economy here. And then lumber, and then tourism is the other thing. We figured that with the lack of students coming in, stressed out healthcare system, crustaceans no longer going to Asia, and tourists not coming in, that the place would fold. And actually, we've seen quite the opposite. There's actually been an uptick economy of very local level entrepreneurship that is drastically changing how things were done. And I think what is really important at both national and local levels is to have the ability to support innovation in a time like this. We've seen the litany of critiques of globalization about how wealth gets concentrated to one group, how we use too much carbon in another area. Those are all valid critiques that don't get dismissed from COVID. But going forward, if there's a time for people to begin innovations for new economies, this is where governments have to be brave. There's a small, that Mr. Biden may actually promote that with green technology in the United States. It might be, but we've seen incidents of that where governments are able to support that innovation coming out of it, and that might be something that we look at for the next while.
Oh, thanks. Yes, at the back there. Yes.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk, and especially the song by the Canadians. That was really creative. I just have two comments. The first one is on stigma. And I wonder if stigma from the pandemic highlights pre-existing stigma in the society. For example, with HIV/AIDS, you know, stigma was targeted towards women, even though it was transmitted by men, and it was targeted towards the Haitians when the Americans actually give it to the Haitians. And I think in a Aotearoa context, Asian people have been stigmatized previously for issues around housing, for example. So I wondered if the pandemic just exposed that a little bit more. And similarly, another stigma that I personally experienced during the pandemic was actually towards South Auckland in the second wave. I'm from South Auckland, and when the second wave broke, I was in hospital on shift with a colleague, and my colleague made a very offhand comment about South Auckland, and I really was very annoyed about that. So I think that's another kind of dimension of stigma that's relevant to Aotearoa context, is that inequity, you know, that is in South Auckland.
Right. No, you're on the money there. Stigma today in the 21st century is based on a lot of predispositions about identities of people, and a lot of that is rooted in really, really toxic coloniality. We see it here in Canada, right? We see, especially in the United States, the targeting of people who appear to be from Asian descent. Just the blame, the isolation, it's not good. And you're right, it's based on these historical tendencies to do that. The other health attribute to that is that when people are stigmatized and people are now adjusting their behavior in order to minimize stigmatization, they then remove themselves from participation in the community, participation in the system, the willingness to feel open if there is a health issue to report. And that, again, is something that we don't want to see. Like months and months of isolation has not been mentally healthy for anybody. So then to layer on stigmatization on top of that only goes the extra mile. And what, you know, the offhanded comments, I mean, it's hurtful, right? It's not great to be at the brunt end of that. And what we're also seeing is that there's other groups that are being brought into this who are facing that, who may not have traditionally done so. The people who've got connections between Canada and the United States across the borders, typically, you know, Americans were just, a bit of friendly rivalry in the sports, you know, that was sort of the thing. But now it's vicious. I mean, your car is going to get messed up. You are going to get in a physical altercation. I don't remember that before, but it's also a very telling reminder that when a society is fearful of something and the scapegoats are being presented within that community, the actions are horrible. And I think that this is going to hopefully expose, the study we're doing here, I should say, is going to expose a lot of hard work that communities in Nova Scotia have to do to really become inclusive.
Yes. Do we have a final question from anybody? Yes, Jackie.
Thank you, Bob. What came through really strongly in your talk, and obviously was the title of your talk, that the methods being used to mitigate or to manage COVID-19 are ancient methods.
Yep.
And obviously there are associated disadvantages. What would you suggest as the alternatives then?
Well, I think the thing that we need to start working on is looking at examples where things like stigma, things like toxic nationalism aren't coming through the COVID experience. And it's why I include Cuba and Sierra Leone on this. Again, of course, I include New Zealand on it because the world champion on dealing with COVID. But the point about Cuba and about Cuba and Sierra Leone is that these are countries that are able to deal with the virus in a way that isn't promoting the risk of stigmatization in the same way that other nations are. There's still the risk of stigmatization in both countries. Sierra Leone between the urban and the rural. Cuba between health workers who are working abroad and those who are inside. People who have got family in the United States and Cuba have also been subject to stigmatization. Stigma occurs in those ways. But the question then is, if no matter what we do is going to be a form of stigmatization, how then do we work more towards maintaining the health of people, the wellness of people? It's shattering to think that in the United States that during COVID-19, 100,000 people were at risk of losing their health insurance because of the virus itself. I mean, that's a reckless policy that needs to be rethought of. We can't go into the 22nd century with that sort of archaic thinking. So there's no really easy answer to that, Jackie, but what I think we can do as scholars and policymakers right now is quit looking where we've looked in the past, right? Quit looking in what's going on in Whitehall, what's going on in Washington, what's going on in Ottawa. Let's look at what's going on in Freetown and Havana. Let's find ways to communicate to policymakers there, to learn about those experiences in a more deep way, to figure out, is this working, is it's not, and what's the new set of challenges?
Thank you. Very interesting, Bob. I was in Freetown in January, and people were telling me how they'd cope with Ebola. Obviously, it was a terrible event, but they learned to cope with it, to quarantine, to lockdown, and so on. And they weren't complacent, but they felt they knew how to deal with this new threat. And I was really very impressed with the viewpoints of the people there at the time. So, Bob, this has been a fascinating talk. I realize it's the middle of the night there in Halifax.
I'm just going to stay up, Tony. I'm going to pull the old all-nighter.
I guess if you're in New Zealand, you'd be having your Milo.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, this is like jet lag without the jet. It's really interesting.
Bob, you've done a wonderful job. It's been absolutely fascinating. And all my friends here at the University of Otago and the leadership group of the Otago Global Health Institute, we really want to join together to thank you for putting so much into this. It was just so engaging. And I'm sure you'll all like to join with me in thanking Bob for this amazing presentation. So Bob, I hope we're going to see you back here soon.
I'm very heartbroken. I can't be back in Otago with you guys. As the former Ron Lister visiting fellow, you people stole my heart, and it's still there. So I need to come back and see you as soon as I can.
Well, the feeling's mutual, I can assure you, Bob. So thank you very much indeed, Bob. We're really grateful to you. Thank you. Thank you.
Have a great night, everybody. Enjoy your dinner out.
And good night to you all. Thank you. And we look forward to the second day of the conference tomorrow. Thank you.